Welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus, everybody. My name's Mike Pierce, and today we're excited to start a major, brand new series on the end of the early church and the start of the Middle Ages.
Yes, and my name is Coel Campo, and actually in the spring of last year, we ran a series on the beginnings of Christianity up to 300-ish. So now we're picking up the story from there.
Yes, this is going to be covering the period from the early 4th century through to 430 or so.
Right. So now everybody agrees that this period is one of the most important in church history, and it saw massive changes. But you actually think it is the most important period, and that's probably because you really, really don't like the changes, isn't it?
Well, yes. Basically, early Christianity got stood on its head in many respects, and we're still not free, even in a completely different kind of society, a pluralist, secular society, from the mindset generated then.
Right. And we're going to go through this process blow by blow to see how that all happened.
Right.
So we're calling this first episode the Constantine effect because he was a bit of a game changer.
Yeah, he was. His role is sometimes, far too frequently exaggerated. So many preachers and others insist that Constantine makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Not true. Not true. You will not find a single proper history book that will say any such thing. But nevertheless, as you say, he is a real game changer. Well, let's just remind ourselves of the spread of Christianity up to 300 or so. Obviously, it starts in Roman-occupied Judea, but it doesn't stay there for long. So here, we've got a map showing the spread of Christianity in the apostolic period, so by 100 at the latest, and that's shown in dark grey. And this reflects closely the kind of maps that people have in the back of their Bibles. Very often, it'll have a map of this kind showing where Paul went and where other missionary journeys happened and this kind of thing. And up to 185, so late 2nd century, in light grey. And we can see that it's really concentrated, particularly in the east, in what is now Turkey, as well as the Levant and Judea and so on, in Egypt, and at least in the coastal areas of Greece, a little bit of central Italy there, a little bit of the Maghreb, well, quite a large bit of the Maghreb actually, in the western end of North Africa, and along the Rhone Valley in what they will have called Gaul, we call France.
Now, were there Jewish people already living in these different areas, or is Christianity mostly taking up new converts at this point?
Well, in the earliest period, it's particularly picking up on Jews, and this was something we discussed in the first episode, you remember, of our first series. And there were Jews living pretty much in all of these areas. So it's impossible to miss if you read the book of Acts that Paul and indeed the others target synagogues in all of these different areas outside of Judea and Samaria as their jumping off points for evangelism. But it spreads beyond that. By the time you get to late in the 1st century, I mean, I'm only estimating here, but something like this, the majority of people becoming Christians are actually Gentiles. Right. So the early decades, overwhelmingly Jews, and in particular, kind of half Jews, people that scholars call God-fearers, Gentiles who attended synagogues because monotheism is obviously more rational than polytheism, and the morality that went with Judaism appealed to them, but they were considered second-class citizens in the synagogues. They were particularly likely to become Christians, right? But then after most of those who are going to jump ship, religiously speaking, had done so, And again, just estimating here, let's say by the 70s of the first century, maybe the 80s, then the trickle of pagan Gentiles becoming Christians, that becomes then the main supply of people converting to this new faith. But very often, a lot of chatter about this whole phenomenon of the first few hundred years just emphasizes the Roman Empire. And that's unfortunate. There are two reasons for this. One, because the lasting impact in a lot of the Middle Ages will be not entirely, but mostly in the areas that had been Roman Empire, right? But the other is the survival of documents. So this other map shows us all the other directions in which Christianity grew during those first couple of centuries. There was a very, very strong presence of Christianity in Persia, the Persian Empire, Rome's old enemy. And they were treated quite nicely there while they were being persecuted in the Roman Empire. And then when, after 313, the Romans decided they would no longer persecute Christianity, the Persians then started to persecute Christians as potential agents of their enemy, this kind of thing. Right?
Right.
But there was a major impact there. There was a spread of Christianity south into Sudan, later into what we call Ethiopia, and so on. So there was the spread through to India. But again, our problem is that lots of documents have been destroyed.
Now, Christians had been persecuted for 250 years, but it was the start of the 4th century that really saw the biggest and the worst of the persecution.
Yes, it was. And it's for that reason it's called the Great Persecution. And if you want to know why they were persecuted, have a look at episode 2 of our first series on the early church. We'll give you a link here because that goes into it in detail. Okay, so let's have a lightning fast overview of those persecutions. So the persecution was episodic. It was continual rather than continuous, right? And it starts in 64 AD and goes through to 312, maybe 311. So it's almost 250 years. The first one under Nero was confined largely to the city of Rome. Later ones weren't. They were much more widespread. The Decian persecution, so called because it's under the Emperor Decius from 249 to 251, that was empire-wide. And there were lots of other more local bouts, for example, in Lugdunum, that we'd call Lyon, in what to us is France, in the late 2nd century. Some horrible outbursts around the same period of time in the Maghreb, in North Africa. But as we just said, the persecution under Emperor Diocletian from 303 onwards was also empire-wide and easily the biggest and the worst, producing a very large number of martyrs, especially among church leaders. They were prime targets to be killed, and many of them would be revered thereafter as patron saints of their cities.
For good reason, perhaps.
Well, for good reason, right? Yeah, they're associated with it then forever, because Christianity is, in a rather perverse way, triumphant, so to speak, and they will have been much more comfortable with that language than I think we would. And so they don't simply fade into obscurity. They're now publicly celebrated as heroes. Well, what are the effects of the persecution in the period before Constantine? Well, it helped to hasten the development of doctrine. And again, this is something that we looked at in the last series, particularly when we considered the heretics and so on. What was and what was not worth dying for? Where do you stand and say, well, if you're going to kill me, kill me. I'm not going to capitulate on this. And it helped hasten the emergence of church hierarchy about who can make authoritative decisions about what to do or not do in an emergency of this sort. Of course, because before modern times, everybody lived overwhelmingly simply in the locality where they were. Right? So news was what was happening locally. It fostered serious arguments about how churches should treat people who'd buckled under pressure once that latest emergency had subsided. And that led, unfortunately, to schisms, as it has done again in modern times, for example, in China and in the Soviet Union under the communists, over rigorous responses. So, for example, followers of a chap called Novatian after the persecution of 250, and followers of Donatist after the great persecution under Diocletian. They were rigorous types, and the bulk of the church didn't in the end go with them for reasons we can't discuss here. It also set in motion what would later become the cult of the saints. And again, we consider how that should possibly happen in the episode we gave over to consider persecution in the early church in that first series. And in the same way, set up an ideal of and a theology about martyrdom.
Yeah, and if this sounds like a lot of information, that's because we did an entire series on this before.
Right, yes. So please do go back and look at the second episode of our first series on the early church.
Right. And I feel like this slide makes me laugh a little bit because...
What a terrible sense of humor. Go on. Because...
That's true. Well, I mean, to me, it's more funny when people today in the church will say things like, well, we really should just live the way that the Christians did in the early church and the way that they did in Acts. And I just think, well, it's really just not the same now, is it?
No, it's not. No, not at all. No. Yes, that's really true. Okay, well, the man who more than anyone, he's not solely responsible, but more than anyone is behind this last great persecution is Diocletian, who is from Salona, which is now called Solin and is part of the city of Split on the Adriatic coast. He was from there, and very unusually for pre-modern rulers of any kind, let alone Roman emperors, he actually retired rather than died or get killed in office. He retired, stood down, and built a palace near Salona to retire to, which still stands to this day and is the centre of the city of Split. It should be mentioned, by the way, that he also persecuted Manichaeans, who are described wrongly, as I think, in a lot of books about this period as a Christian heresy. They weren't. They had a lot in common with particular heresies, but they were a separate religion. They didn't claim to be Christians. He persecuted them as well. So rather ferocious as Roman rulers went, because they tried to avoid persecution when they could. In the case of Christianity, they thought they couldn't avoid it, again for reasons that we consider in that first series. Well, here's a few examples of some of these really rather heroic bishops, church leaders who were martyred. Of course, we don't really know what they look like. These are either modern or medieval representations of them. So we could start with St. Domnius, who in Croatian it comes as Sveti Dujam today, born in Antakya, but he became bishop of Salona, Diocletian's hometown, around 300. The persecution starts 3 years later, and the following year he is martyred.
So even this early on in church history, we're already having hierarchy with bishops and other titles arise.
Right, and you remember we considered this again in another episode in that first series, with a number of which I can't remember, but the link is going to come up, ding, now by magic. Somebody called Coel doing the editing. That's right, yes.
We hope.
We hope. So, yeah, as I said, this is part of the city of Split today, halfway down the Adriatic coast. That tower there is the tower of the cathedral, and it's built on the site of Diocletian's pagan temple inside the palace he retired to. So a couple of hundred years, a bit more than a couple of hundred years actually, after he died, Salona was overrun by barbarians. People fled to the nearest stronghold. They went inside the palace because it had got high walls. That became the centre of the city of Split. By then, this population was culturally Christian, and so they turned his pagan temple into a cathedral, which it still is today. Well, This shows us another such church leader, Saint Quirinus. Nowadays he goes by Sveti Quirin, who was Bishop of Roman Siscia, which is Croatian Sisak, about 40 miles southeast of Zagreb, and he was martyred near the end of that persecution in 309. And here we have St. Maurus commemorated inside this wonderful basilica church. He's the patron saint of Parentium, modern Porec. He's on the third from the left inside there, and he's holding a martyr's crown. According to tradition, he was from Africa and was of noble birth. He became the city's first bishop, and he too was martyred in the Great Persecution.
Yeah, and this is a place you and I have been to a few times.
Yeah, that's right.
A great place for tourists.
It really is, yes. Maybe a bit hard on the locals in the height of the summer, but for the rest of the year, just a beautiful place to be, yes. And then finally, we could give numerous examples. This guy, Irenaeus, now he's not the Irenaeus. Irenaeus was a reasonably common name, and he was Bishop of Sirmium and was beheaded in March 304 because he wouldn't offer pagan sacrifices, which was the usual test for Christians. Are you going to offer pagan sacrifices, or are you going to let us kill you?
Right. Now, Sirmium was an important capital for part of the Roman Empire back then, but it's really just a fairly minor town today.
Yes, today it's called Sremska Mitrovica, and it still has extensive Roman ruins, which you can go see there, actually undercover, unlike all the stuff in Salona. But yeah, it was one of the most important towns in the Roman Empire and was used effectively as a capital when the empire was being governed in several bits in the later stages. Yes, that's right. Well, those are just some for instances. But we want to go on now to what happens after Constantine takes charge.
Right, and it's Constantine who brings the persecution to a permanent end.
Right, he does. He takes charge in 312, fighting his way across Europe. From Britain, actually. He was the son of a very important Roman commander and was with him when his father died in Eboracum, which is York to you and me. And the soldiers thereupon declared the son, Constantine, emperor. But of course he had to fight for it, and it took him 6 years from 306 to get to the gates of Rome. And he fought his way in and succeeded in making himself emperor, and shortly thereafter declares a toleration.
So this next slide is really summing up what we're going to spend the next few weeks looking at.
Right. Yeah, these are the key developments. It's like an overview of everything we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks and revisiting in detail. So up to 311, Christianity suffers the worst of the Roman persecutions. From 313, the year after Constantine takes charge, the Edict of Milan declares a religious toleration. And really that's directed just at Christianity because it's the only major religion that's being persecuted. And Christianity, in fact, wins imperial favour. And so from then down to 386, so I do the math, that's 73 years, legal and social pressures favouring Christianity led to a massive influx into the churches.
Now, the massive influx is because it's no longer dangerous to be a Christian, or because there's some social pressure to be one, or maybe just a mix of both?
It's a mixture of the two things. The restraints have been taken away, but also the trouble is that those encouragements will get rather too impressive in the years ahead. So in 386, at the end of this, 2.5 generations, maybe 3 generations, Theodosius, a later emperor, outlawed pagan sacrifices. And although it was still possible thereafter not to be a Christian, it became extremely difficult.
So in 75 years, Christianity has gone from being persecuted to becoming a persecutor.
Right, and it's grotesque. And to reason yourself into that, you're going to have to upend loads of things that you've been saying up until that point. Right, you're going to have to start saying the opposite. And part of the purpose, one of the central purposes of this series, is to look at how that happens, right? Because it brings about fundamental changes in the way that Christian theology is constructed, the way the church is structured, although to be honest, that's more an acceleration of trends that were already in play before 313, but an acceleration of the rise of hierarchy and so on. So that's one of the big things we're going to be looking at. So by century's end, Christianity had in effect become the official and nearly compulsory religion. And that's a change accompanied by a revolution in Christian theology.
And again, that revolution is a lot of what this series is all about.
Right, it is. That's the reason we're here, folks, for this one. That's so this is going to get awfully familiar over the next few weeks because that's the main thing we're looking at.
Sounds juicy.
Yes, yes. Well, I know there are some people who've actually been smacking their lips and anticipating this for some while. If you remember, we kind of promised that we would do it in the fall, and here we are in March 2025. I say this for anybody who happens to be looking at this podcast about 10 years from now. And now we're finally getting around to it. Okay, well, let's take a look at this map then.
So when Constantine starts to favor Christianity, it looks like he could have counted on much more support in the east of the empire rather than in the west.
Yes, there's loads of maps of this kind out there showing the spread of early Christianity in the first century, second, third, and so on. And they all tell the same basic story, that what we see is an intensification of Christian presence in areas where there was already at least something by the end of the New Testament period. Right, and so there was geographic spread. You can see here that there's a whole load of stuff on the eastern coasts of Spain and quite some way inland and so on. But mostly what we're seeing is an intensification of that presence. Now, we don't know how many Christians were in the empire at the time Constantine comes to power. Estimates run as low as 5% of the population and as high as 15%. So if we just go for a middle of the ballpark estimate and say 10%, you're not going to be far wrong, but it's heavily skewed, right? It's skewed towards the east. And so that means that in large parts of the West, it will have been almost nothing. In many places in the East, it might have been, say, 20%. In some places, it may even have been a majority. Okay, so here's a bust of our man. And you can see he's born around 272. He dies in 337, excuse me. So that means he's about 40 years old when he takes occupation of Rome as emperor. And he reigns for 25 years thereafter. We have some coins here from his reign. And here is a picture of the city of Niš in southern Serbia. It's the biggest city in southern Serbia, the Roman Nais, and that was his birthplace. It wasn't quite where his parents were from, but that's where they were when he was born. And there's a monument here by the Nishava River commemorating the 1700th anniversary of the Battle of Milvian Bridge, which happened not there, obviously, but outside Rome.
Now, remind us what the Battle of the Milvian Bridge was all about.
Okay, well, that comes at the end of his trek towards Rome with his soldiers from York, right? And it had taken him 6 years to fight his way from there down to the gates of Rome. And that's the battle that he fights to get into the city and make himself emperor. And he wins that battle. Now, there's a whole bunch of mythology around the battle, which we need not take too seriously. According to this myth, and it's a chap called Eusebius, who we'll encounter quite a bit in following weeks, a little bit more in a few moments. According to Eusebius, he sees a vision including a sign in the sky saying under this sign, conquer. And he paints a symbol which, to people who don't know the Greek alphabet, looks like an X and a P superimposed on one another. It's actually the Greek letters chi and rho, which are the first two letters in the name of Christ. And he has that painted on the shields of his soldiers, and he wins his battle. Now, that chi rho symbol had before been used as shorthand for other words beginning with those letters. That's the first time it's been used as a symbol for Christ, but that's going to stick around for hundreds of years thereafter, the chi rho symbol.
So Constantine is already getting into the Christian groove at this point.
Well, yes, if that can be called particularly Christian, yes. We should take a little sidestep here to mention his mother, Helena. And we have her here commemorated on a coin. She was quite low-born. She's from Bithynia in Asia Minor and was divorced by Constantine's father, in the late 280s. And so she then fades totally into obscurity, except that she's got her son. And the son continues to serve in the military with his father, so that remains her slender link to continuing prominence. But then he becomes emperor. According to Eusebius, and we can believe this if we want, but we don't have any other evidence either way, she was converted to Christianity by her son. There are problems with that, as we'll see in a moment. More certainly, she did go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land near the end of her life, where she founded several churches, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
So she's influential somewhat in Christian history.
Yeah, she is. She's revered as a saint, yes. Now, here's a later representation of the Council of Nicaea that happens on Constantine's watch in 325.
Yeah, and just remind us, where is Nicaea exactly?
Well, today it's the Turkish city of Iznik, and it's not too far from Istanbul, in fact, pretty close. And yeah, it's one of the most important councils held during his reign.
Right, and it was actually summoned not by the church's own leaders, but by Constantine, right?
Right. And this mention here is really just a placeholder. It's too important not to be flagged up in this overview episode, but we're going to discuss it properly in a future episode of this series.
We might let you get away with that, I suppose.
Yes, please be generous. It's really discussing the nature of Christ, and the Nicene Creed that is used by Christians today refers back to it. The link isn't quite that clear cut, but we're not going to get into all that now. We just need to remember that Constantine's the one calling the council. Now, that in itself is incredibly significant, right? Just remind ourselves that just a decade and a half before, Christians are being mercilessly persecuted. Then it stops. Now they're being favoured. Now they're holding a church council, but it's held under the imperial auspices, not the church leaders' auspices. And that in itself tells you a lot about the direction things are going from very early on in this process. Another key development we must mention in respect to the reign of this man is his role as founder of the city of Constantinople.
And why did Constantine want to found a new city? And why does he name it after himself?
Yeah, I think he named it after himself because he's a big head. Now, if you want to cut him a little slack, think of all the Caesareas named after Caesar or the Alexandrias named after Alexander, right? So I think there's precedent. But this is a man who calls his kids Constantine II, Constantius, Constans, and Constantina, right? So this is a guy suffering from what in good Latin we could call magnum cranium, I think. So there's that. But he wants this to be a new capital for two reasons. One, the Roman Empire was proving unwieldy. It had grown and grown and grown. And of course, in a day before modern communication systems and telecommunications and all that, it was extremely difficult to coordinate everything. So he had the idea that if you have two capitals, Rome and Constantinople, you can govern the empire in two halves, and that'll make things somehow easier. It didn't work. It simply doubled up on the administration. From that point of view, it was a failure. But from the point of view of Constantinople having a glorious future in front of it, which we can't really look at now, it was a big success, I suppose. The other reason was because Christianity, the religion he was increasingly favouring, was so much stronger in the East, as we saw from the maps. Right? And so he wanted somewhere that would be a Christian or Christianish kind of environment for governing half of the empire, whereas Rome was associated constantly with the old pagan gods. It needed a little Christian mythologizing. Takes deep breath because realizes he's about to offend some people around Peter and others. In order to make it in any sense Christian, right?
Right.
So there are these two things going on here, to say nothing, although we did just say something about his own ego.
Yeah.
Okay, so was Constantine really a Christian?
Yes, this is a much debated question. So get on with it if you would.
Okay, thank you for putting it so nicely. Yeah, dear viewers, you can see the way I'm treated around this place.
It's really terrible, isn't it?
It is terrible. It is terrible, yes. My judgment would be probably not, actually. And I think most historians would take the same view. Throughout his career, he seems to have thought of the Christian God as the God who won his battles, thinking in particular of the Battle of Milvian Bridge. He also seems to have conflated it with the sun god. Now, his father was a Mithraist, that is, worshipped the sun god Mithras, which was an Eastern god whose devotees were all men and mostly soldiers. And he seems to have conflated the two things. Now, I don't think he was completely stupid. Clearly, he wasn't completely stupid. So we're left with the unpersuasive idea that he was confused or that he was doing this deliberately. And I think common sense drives us towards the thought that he was doing it deliberately. Some years into his reign, he makes Sunday, the day of the sun, a holiday every week, which we have inherited.
Right.
So, yeah. Why the Council of Nicaea? Well, we mentioned that a moment ago. There were big disputes in the church about the nature of Christ. Is Christ really the incarnation of God, or is he just a superior human being? Is he a created being? Now, Constantine, I think, genuinely didn't understand the issues involved, but he was certain that the Christian God would not continue to favour him in battle if his church was divided. And so this issue needed to be settled. Right? So he convened the council for that reason. Again, why Constantinople? We just consider that. He seems to have wanted a Christian kind of environment for governing the empire, but that was certainly not his only reason. he is baptized on his deathbed. Now, for reasons I think we mentioned in our episode on the changing ideas about sacraments last time, and we will look at this more again in a few weeks, views of sacraments were moving in a direction that we can only call higher with the passing of time. That is, more instrumental value was given to communion and to baptism than had been the case in the earliest years. Now, if you think that baptism in itself, by virtue of doing this ritual, makes you clean from sin, there are two opposite directions you can go in from there. One, and this is the one that clearly won out and was beginning to move forward quite fast even in his own time, was you get little babies and you baptize them, or christen them at any rate, straight away, right? To be on the safe side. Or you can do what Constantine did, which is leave it to your deathbed in the hope that you don't commit any more sins after that, which rather misunderstands exactly how sinful we are. But you can understand it particularly in respect of something like a secular ruler who is doing extremely bad things all the time, as secular rulers often still have to do. I mean, this is someone who had one of his relatives, I think it was his stepsister's husband, executed in 316, and had his own wife executed in 326. So he might have felt that he wanted to wait until his deathbed so he couldn't commit any more sins. And so finally, we're left with this issue. Now, is it incomplete understanding on his part or studied ambiguity? I would suggest it doesn't much matter which we go for, but he's probably not really a Christian. And I would, in any case, go for studied ambiguity. There's an awful lot of political calculation going on here, which is not to say that he's not sincere in as far as it goes.
Right. Yeah, this is interesting because you and I have talked in multiple episodes about Christianity as really not being, Jesus really didn't start it as a way to form a government. But this guy comes along, sees the principles of Christianity, and thinks, hey, this could actually really benefit my empire. And it actually does for a while.
Right. Well, but in his reign, it's much less thought through. It's kind of like feeling your way forward. And the theological revolution happens during the course of the 4th and early 5th centuries, which does end up justifying precisely that. But in Constantine's own lifetime, as we've seen with, it being him that calls a church council together, this kind of stuff, it's not a thought through program completely, but that's the direction in which things are moving. Okay, so this book is a little elderly now, but I'm sure you could still find it on Amazon somewhere or something like that. Alistair Key, Constantine versus Christ, and he is making the case very strongly that Constantine is not, in fact, a Christian. So he's going into that whole discussion there in a lot more detail than we can do here. Yes. Okay, so we also have to mention properly this guy, Eusebius of Caesarea, who's an influential churchman and prolific author. And by far his most important works are the Ecclesiastical History. As I used to say to my students all the time, if you can't stand church history, don't blame me, blame him. He invented it. He used a whole load of documents up to his own time, obviously, to construct that history. A lot of those documents we have too, so we can corroborate or falsify what he says. But on some things, the documents themselves are no longer extant, and we simply have to take Eusebius' word for it. He certainly does have quite a few polemical irons in the fire and points to make. And quite a lot of those points are sadly mistaken. His other most famous book is his Life of Constantine, which has been described not so much as a biography as a hagiography. Constantine, in his view, was the most wonderful person ever because he'd ended the persecution of the church and he started to shower favours on the church and so on.
Right, and Eusebius and Constantine were actually friends, right?
Yeah, they were. Yes. Yeah.
So did Eusebius end up influencing his policy all that much?
I don't think so. But what he really has influenced is how we see this period, right? Even when we don't really believe him or accept his view, his writings have been extremely influential. And so it's hard not to see things at least somewhat through his eyes. Yeah. Okay, well, here's just a paragraph from that Life of Constantine, which will give you a flavour of how hagiographical this work is, but that's not really the reason we're looking at it now. We're looking at this passage now to start to see how Christian attitudes towards secular authority have changed dramatically from what they had been just a couple of decades before. So, our emperor derives the source of his authority from above. Now, you could say, well, that's totally unremarkable. Romans 13 effectively says as much, that government is instituted by God, but he wants to be much more specific than that. Right, he's wanting to endorse specific rulers, and of course we know which one, right? Which is going a lot further than the New Testament warrants. I mean, Romans 13 was written during the reign of Nero, and it's certainly not endorsing that man Nero, who was about to persecute Christians as well as doing many other terrible things. Okay, so he derives the source of his authority from above and is strong in the power of his sacred title, bringing those whom he rules on earth to the only begotten Word or Saviour. He renders them fit subjects for his kingdom. He subdues and chastens the adversaries of truth according to the usages of war.
Wow. So Eusebius thinks that it's the emperor's job to make people Christians and to fight Christianity's enemies in battle?
Yeah, that's how this sounds, absolutely, yes. And this is just being written, 2.5 decades after the persecution has stopped. Now, Eusebius is some way ahead of his time, and he's perhaps not entirely representative as fawning on the new emperor to the degree that he does. But nevertheless, it's an ominous sign for the future, because by the end of the century, it is going to become the case that Christianity really will be the official religion of the empire, and using official force, muscle, to push people into this faith. Now, he says he, the emperor, Constantine, frames his earthly government according to the pattern of the divine original. Now, if Karl Marx ever read that line, he must have been laughing and laughing and laughing. Because according to Marx, he's saying that that's all that religion is anyway, right? He believes in a solely materialist universe. There's no God, and all this stuff we project into an imaginary heaven in order to reflect it back onto earth and say, so there you are. God or the gods favour our political setup. Which, it has to be said, though obviously I'm a sworn enemy of Marx, it has to be said, does neatly describe how religion has been and is to this day used by many professing religious people. Okay, so there it is again. So feeling strength in its conformity with the monarchy, remember monarchy means rule of one, monarchy of God. For surely monarchy far transcends every other constitution and form of government, since its opposite, democratic equality of power, may rather be described as anarchy and disorder.
This idea about monarchy transcending everything else, that's not exactly a controversial opinion at the time, though, is it? I mean, it's really what almost everyone thinks.
Yes, that's right, and would be until very modern times. So, to that extent, what he's writing there is platitudinous. The remarkable thing is not and please, nobody watching this should run away with the idea, oh my goodness, Christians up until then had favoured democratic equality about. They hadn't. They had not favoured any kind of politics whatsoever. But they had been seen as socially and politically subversive just by existing and living as they did and doing as they did. This was why they were persecuted, right? So to go from that situation to coming out with these, everybody knows this kind of platitudes about the authority of the emperor is a 180-degree turn. Right. Okay, well, let's just finish off here by looking at Constantine's successors, particularly his sons and his nephew. They don't all follow precisely his own policy. Some of them tilt towards the Arianism, that is, on the losing side at the Council of Nicaea. They also fight like heck amongst themselves, but nevertheless, they are all broadly in favour of Constantine's program of upholding what they consider to be Christianity as the favoured religion in the empire. So here's his family tree. So you've got Flavius Constantius at the top, marrying Helena. Remember, we mentioned her earlier, and their son is Constantine.
And it looks like Constantine was married twice.
Yes, he was. Once to someone called Minervina, and they have a son, Crispus. I mean, there's some dispute as to whether she was actually his wife or simply a concubine. And then he is later married to Fausta, whom, as we mentioned, he has executed. And they have a son, Constantine, who becomes Constantine II immediately after his father's death. There's also Constantius II, emperor with him, and Constans, another co-emperor. They have a daughter, Helena, named after Constantine's mother, and a daughter, Constantia or Constantina. Now, these brothers fought like heck amongst themselves, and they also killed off a whole load of other possible rivals. And late on, control passes to Julian, who was a nephew of Constantine, the son of his half-brother, who marries Helena, Constantine's elder daughter, and he becomes emperor in 361. Now, he's called Julian the Apostate, and this is because he had only pretended or affected to be a Christian while his cousins were in control and fighting amongst themselves, because it was an extremely dangerous world. And once he felt free not to worry about that anymore, he renounced Christian faith and started to favour the pagan gods and wanted a pagan revival in the empire. It didn't last very long because he didn't last very long, and he died in battle in 363, and after his death there's a reversion to the trajectory that Rome is now on. He's an unusual character, is Julian. He's not some stern figure like the old pagan Roman emperors. He was heavily ascetic and, in his own strange way within paganism, rather pious. But he's not around for very long, so he doesn't, as I say, really affect the trajectory that things are going. So what we're going to do next week is tell the second end of this story down to the early 5th century and the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, at least. And then we're going to go back and look at all the changes that happen inside the church and the changes in theology that supposedly legitimize this transformed status of Christianity in the Roman world.
I have a feeling this is going to take us several episodes.
Yes, are we allowed to confess things to our audience here? We have a little game plan that this is going to be, about 6 episodes. I'm already getting an ugly feeling that it's going to be a bit longer than that, but maybe I'll be wrong. We'll see. This happened with us once before. I think it may happen again, but we'll see how it goes.
Well, thanks for staying with us, and stay tuned, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, bye now.